The Daltons were a gang of outlaws who robbed trains and banks in Kansas and Oklahoma territory in the 1890s. They also were well known for supplying liquor to the Indians in the Oklahoma territory. They were not a very good group of people, I don't think. At least historically, that's what people say. And there's a picture of a couple of the wanted posters for them. You'll notice that they're Grat, Emmett, and Bob, the three Dalton brothers. And they're on the other one. These guys have mustaches, these guys don't. They like to use disguises. The robbery in Coffeyville on October 5th, 1892 made national news. It was all over the country because it was a pretty big bloodbath in the town of Coffeyville. Small town USA, all these people killed in a bank robbery, my gosh. The Daltons were also famous at the time, and the Daltons were basically wiped out in this robbery. So, newspapers everywhere had the story. It even turned into a bit of a Dalton craze. Today, there are museums. There are two of them at least. You can see Dalton's original equipment, you can see things from the raid, you know, you can see everything. There are books, or there are movies, and there are books, and there's even a band. I put this one out here because you can see that he's wearing the band's name on his shirt right there. You know? So I've never heard them, don't have a clue what they do, but they exist. On October 5th, 1892, the Daltons robbed two banks, the First National Bank of Coffeyville and the C.M. Condon and Company Bank. The C.M. Condon Company and Bank became a national bank in 1903, but that was 11 years after the robbery. The banks were across the street from each other. And at this point, I want to take your indulgence or ask your indulgence to put up with a couple of slides that are not really in sequence because they're kind of telling the story before I tell the story. If I don't show you the pictures first, it, I think, is a little more confusing. So hopefully the pictures will make what I say a little more understandable. The cheeky Daltons decided that they wanted to do something to put their name in the history books. They were going to outdo Jesse James. Jesse James had never robbed two banks in the same city at the same time. So they were going to one-up him. Good luck. The Dalton brothers were Bob, Grat, and Emmett. Bob was the oldest and he was leader of the gang. They also had accomplices for this raid who were Bill Powers and Dick Broadwell. Now you may see other names for these two people because they went under a bunch of aliases, and depending on where they were and what time, they may have used a different name. So that's one other problem with the story here. That when they arrived in Coffeyville shortly after 9 a.m., they found that the streets were more crowded than normal. One reason is that the Daltons had lived in Coffeyville for about 5 years in the mid-1880s. They were known by the people of Coffeyville. Their parents still lived in town. Okay, well, how are you going to pull off this thing in disguise when everybody knows you? That's one strike against the Daltons. And there is a city, or the downtown of Coffeyville. The scene shows First National Bank, the Condon Bank, and this is Isham's hardware store, which we'll get to in a minute. It's another important part of the story. You'll also notice that there are three guys running out of the Condon Bank right there. And there's all this smoke because the citizens in the town are just shooting the life out of the Condon Bank, and you basically see all the smoke from it. And here's an overhead view of the thing. Right here is the Condon Bank, right here's First National Bank and Isham's Hardware. And what happened here is the Daltons came down what is now called Death Alley, hitched their horses over here. They then marched down the alley here. Some went to the Condon, some went to the First National Bank. As the robbery progressed, got over, the people who were robbing the Condon Bank came back out in the front, you saw the picture there, and went up the alley, and the ones that were robbing the First National Bank went the back way because they stepped out the front and they ran into a barrage of bullets, and they said, this isn't going to work. So they went out the back door and went around. The Marshall Connolly arrow on there is for the town marshal, T. Connolly. He organized a number of people into a posse, and they were going to take care of the Daltons. They went around the backside, and we have what is called the alley fight. The robbery started at 9:30 a.m. After hitching their horses in an alley across from the banks, the Daltons, with false beards, marched down the alley, 3 in front and 2 in the rear. Gratt, Power, and Broadwell were in the front, and they entered the C.M. Condon and Company Bank, while Bob and Emmett crossed the plaza of the First National Bank. At the Condon Bank, the three bank employees were forced at gunpoint to put money into a sack. One teller, Charles M. Ball, declared that they couldn't get into the vault because there was a time lock on it, and it was going to take 10 more minutes, according to one story. Another says 45 minutes. I think it was 30 minutes because this was 9:30. The bank was supposed to open at 10. Okay, but the thing is, they didn't have a time lock on the vault. The other thing is, the Dalton people didn't even check to see if the vault was open. They just sat down and waited for half an hour while you're robbing a bank to get into the vault. Okay, well, dumb point number 1. Okay. At the First National Bank, Bob and Emmett took 3 employees hostage. The bookkeeper, the bank bookkeeper, Albert Ayers, and the teller, W.H. Shepard, emptied the teller drawers, and the cashier, Thomas G. Ayers, who was Albert Ayers' father, emptied the vault. Bob and Emmett then forced the 3 bank employees out the front door and followed them. Now you remember, Isham's Hardware was right next door. Isham's Hardware had a whole bunch of weapons and ammunition in it. And when people figured out that the bank was being robbed, the banks were being robbed, they went to Isham's. They got guns, they got ammunition, they got ready. Okay. Bang, 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 as the 3 bank employees from First National go out the door and the 2 robbers, well, you're not going to go into this and run across the street. You're going to go back in the bank. Here, citizens of Coffeyville, aware that a crime was taking place, basically opened fire. And according to the Coffeyville Journal of October 7th, 1892, the citizens of Coffeyville poured about 80 shots into the windows of Condon's Bank. Okay, the gang members in the Condon's Bank returned fire twice, according to one source, and 7 times, according to another source. The crowd on the street also fired at Bob and Emmett and the 3 First National Bank employees. Okay, well, there's a picture of the Condon Bank right after the robbery. You'll notice we've got a couple of holes in the glass there. There are holes over here. There's even a hole up there. I mean, they just blasted that place. Emmett later described how First National Bank cashier Thomas G. Ayers was killed, so you already know the answer to the question I started with. Emmett said, Bob and I started to come out the front way of the bank. Bob stepped on the street and shot his Winchester south once, which goes towards Isham's Hardware. We then went back and went out the back. Met a man with a 6-shooter. Bob killed him. Well, this is one tale. The man with the 6-shooter was supposedly Thomas G. Ayers. Okay? The thing is, if you think about it, you got a front door to the bank where Thomas Ayers and everybody else had gone out. They go back in, they go right out the back door, and Thomas Ayers is by the back door. How could he do that? He'd had to run all the way around the block to get there. He'd had to get a 6-shooter in the meantime. I don't believe this story. According to it, Thomas was shot in the groin and he died the next day. Okay, one story, but I don't believe it. Bob and Emmett then ran around the block and entered the alley at about the same time that the group from the Condon Bank also entered the alley. So we've got them all there now. And this is a picture of the First National Bank inside. On the left is Thomas Ayers, and on the right is W.H. Shepard, the teller. It's the only picture I've ever seen of Mr. Ayers. Mr. Ayers, incidentally, is part of a large family of bankers in Kansas named Ayers. They basically started in Leavenworth and they spread throughout the state. Okay, in the alley, the outlaws were fired on by the citizens and a battle began which lasted about 12 minutes. When it was over, Bill Power, Bob Dalton, Gratt Dalton, and Dick Broadwell were all dead. Emmett was badly wounded. He was shot through the right arm, through his left hip and groin, and he had about 20 pieces of buckshot in his back because somebody came up behind him and just blasted him with a shotgun. Okay, well, this is kind of interesting because all the stolen cash from the First National Bank was recovered. Some of it had buckshot damage to it because Emmett carried the sack with the money over his shoulder and it swung around his back when he was shot. So it probably saved his life, but it did some nasties on some of those notes that were in there. According to another account of the robbery, during this what they called alley fight, Bob Dalton took his rifle and basically aimed and shot somebody over by Isham's Hardware, and that was Thomas Ayers. Shot him in the head, and he died instantly. Whichever tale is correct, you know, Thomas Ayers was the only National Bank officer killed during this robbery. He had been the cashier of the bank since 1885 when it was first organized, till he was killed. The bodies of the dead gunmen were first held up by people in town, just somebody could take a picture. They were then dumped in the city jail, which is right by the death alley. They were thrown in there and just piled up overnight. In the morning, they brought them out, put them in a hay wagon, arranged them, and lots of people took lots of pictures. Photography was a new thing. It was interesting. Hey, this horrible event happened. We survived. Let's take pictures. So I've got a couple of pictures here. The one on the left is the day of the robbery, where they've got the local law enforcement officers holding up a couple of the Daltons. And on the right, we've got the 4 dead Dalton gang members laying in the hay cart. Emmett, he was the only survivor. He was sentenced to a life sentence in prison at the Kansas State Reformatory or Penitentiary at Lansing. He was a model prisoner, and many people thought that Emmett was kind of conned into it. He was the youngest Dalton, and the older brothers used undue influence on him. But people from Coffeyville think that Emmett was really the leader of the whole thing. So, yeah, you got both sides of the story. Anyhow, he was a model prisoner, and he was released after 14 years. He went to California and became a successful real estate developer. He co-authored or authored a couple of books, and he even appeared in a couple of movies, most of them about the Daltons. And are there any notes from this robbery still in existence? That was my big question. You know, I'd love to have a note that survived the Daltons robbery. Well, it has to be from the First National Bank, because the Condon Bank wasn't a national bank then. There are 2 notes from the First National Bank that could have been in the robbery. First one is a serial number 1 $10 brownback. I don't know if it was or not. They did get the money out of the vault, and if a banker had it and kept it in his bank in the vault, it probably went with Emmett. Who knows on that one. And another one is serial number 491, plate position A, which is in choice extra fine. That one probably was taken during the robbery. I looked up the treasury numbers, and it came out just before the robbery. So it's possible it was in there. I've never seen either of these notes, never heard of them, don't know where they are. I'd love to see them. So if anybody knows where they are, I'd love to know. I wonder if Thomas Ayers signed either of these notes. I'm pretty sure that he did, because he was the cashier. Okay, final statistics. Talk about the killed ones. There were 4 in the Dalton gang. Bob Dalton, he killed all the citizens in the raid except for Marshall T. Connolly. Grant Dalton was killed, Tom Evans was killed, Richard Broadwell was killed, but he killed Marshall T. Connolly. And there were 5 citizens killed. There was Thomas G. Ayers, the cashier of the First National Bank, and the other 4 down there. Now, since the Daltons lived here, some of them knew the people that were shooting at them. George Cubine down here was a best friend with Emmett Dalton, and Emmett was basically in tears after he recovered from his injuries because his friend was killed in the robbery. You know, well, I guess that's what you get when you try to be one-upping Jesse James. There's the Condon Bank in 1892. This is before the robbery, so at least get a visual of it. And there is the Condon Bank today. It's called the Perkins Building also because a guy named Perkins designed and built it, and it is a unique structure. Sitting in the middle of the street, streets on both sides of it. There's one building behind it, which is actually part of the bank. And there's the inside today. They have a museum there. It's Coffeyville Historical Society. And there's the First National Bank today. It's on the corner here, and during the robbery, it was over here. So they just moved a couple of doors down the street to where they are today. And on November 9th, 2013, the Condon National Bank of Coffeyville became acquired by the Community State Bank of Coffeyville, and it became the Condon Bank and Trust Company, no longer a national bank. They're currently located at 601 West 8th Street in Coffeyville. First National Bank of Coffeyville is also still in business today.